Welcome to Strength Series episode 5. I hope you've been following along for episodes 1, 2, 3 and 4. If not, go back and watch them because we're going to touch on a couple of topics which probably need that pre-reading. So yeah, this is the apologies if I'm a bit sluggish and not seeing myself. This is my third take of this video because of just technical issues. Well, one of them forgetting to press record as one. Not good. And yeah, so let's get stuck in. So why fatigue management? So it's needed for adaptation. So there's this thing called the SRA curve. And all the SRA curve is you do something, so lift weights, your body responds by being super fatigued, and that's the stimulus. And then you recover from that stimulus and recover a little bit higher than what you did before, providing the stimulus was great enough. And that's called supercompensation or the adaptation. And this is a little bit higher than when you started. So then you do session 2 and you're a little bit stronger in session 3. However, if we don't respect fatigue management and we train, so we're stimulated, and before we're fully recovered, we train again. So then it goes down and down and down. And we end up with what's called maladaptation, which is no good. It's like losing gains, getting sore, getting beaten up. So, and then the flip side is we have a great SRA curve and we train at the peak of the next one, and then the peak of the next one, and the peak of the next one, and infinitely get stronger. If we don't train or we leave it too long, we start, it's called involution, but it's detraining. So stimulate, recover, adapt. So you're stronger than what you were before, but you don't train, and it starts to return back to where you was before. So yeah, so we have to respect the SRA curve to make gains. Now, as a bonus, included in with this is preventing injury, because training just takes its toll on all of your parts. So without fatigue management, connective tissue, tendons, ligaments, and all that good stuff, it might not fully recover, and over a long period of time, then micro trauma might result in something sinister, so like a bicep tear or something like that. You see it all the time, so not good. So it's important. And then step 4 is obviously it stops burnout and ensures longevity of the lifter. So yeah, so good stuff. By all means, there's probably more reasons, but they're the main reasons, or the main reasons as I see the reason for doing fatigue management. So how do we manage fatigue? So within the microcycle itself, we won't talk too much. So on the top 3, you'll notice that it says slide is a dedicated slide for each of them 3. So I'll just say what they are, and then we'll talk the others, and then we'll revisit them in much more detail. So intra-mesocycle with progression and stress management. Preloads, deloads and tapers, big topic. 4, just rest. 5, pivot weeks and switching cycles. A pivot week is basically just doing something that is not powerlifting for a week. So playing basketball, swimming, cycling, even bodybuilding, but that's a little bit close. So it just depends on the individual lifter and where they feel. So if, say for example, someone's got a bad knee, it's probably a good time to do swimming or something instead, to take that stress off and just let them fully recover. A switching cycle is the lifter's heading for burnout and we need to do something different, but they're so tuned we can't afford to take time away really from the competition lift. So what we do, we stylize the training with a specific goal instead. A perfect example would be a speed microcycle. So they learn to lift faster, do plyometrics, lots of technique work. Doing that allows full recovery and restoration while maintaining most of their strength for the most part. External methods, so contrast, massage, ice baths, pulse therapy guns or percussion guns they call them. So there's lots of different ways. And then the other one is supplementation and drugs. Drugs make a massive difference. They can shorten the SRA curve. They can make the SRA curve less shallow but bigger in response. People say you can't just take drugs and get stronger or bigger. Yes, you can. That's how they work. So people that are bedridden with burns or HIV or muscle wasting diseases, that's what them drugs were, and anabolic compounds were developed for. So for people to take them and retain muscle mass or gain muscle mass in a clinical setting. Sadly, bodybuilders just think it was made for bodybuilders, and that if you're not a bodybuilder, steroids don't work because you're not going to the gym. That's not true. Anyway, I digress. Supplementation, so things like curcumin, lower C-reactive protein, can speed up recovery. Creatine can reduce the relative intensity slightly of a single session. So Gakic, there's lots of other little things, but I don't want to talk too much about supplements because I'm going to do a whole series on supplementation. So moving on to the big three then. So the first one is adapting the maximum recoverable volume and minimum effective volume. So keep in mind that MEV and MRV are within a microcycle. So if you only train once a week, the MRV and MEV for that single session is probably pretty high. So the amount that you're going to have to do, create a massive SRA curve, fully recover, and then train again the week after. If you only do like a typical what you would do if you was training 5 times a week, you'll have a normal SRA curve, you'll adapt, you'll get stronger, but then by the time you come to train again, you're probably detrained and back to where you started or close to. So we can change the amount that we do or how we do it to shape the SRA curve. So depending on sport form exercise, SDE, SPE, depends on what we adjust. And the reason is because sport form has to be heavy, always needs to be heavy, needs to be relatively heavy, but we don't need to do too much work with it because your nervous system, once it's stimulated and that strength, that real drive is done, it's done. Doing more and more doesn't really elicit more neural changes. Now, SDE is a little bit lighter, but it's still absolutely heavy. We need to practice it a lot because it's all about the skill of lifting, not so much the neural, even though that's probably the biggest driver, but it's the skill and practice of a certain position or characteristic of the lift. So we need to practice it a lot. So the sets remain quite a high priority and it needs to be super heavy. And the least prioritized for SDE is the relative intensity. And the reason is it needs to be perfect practice. Now, if we are practicing reps till it starts like struggling, there's a good chance you're going to change your technique. So yeah, the reason why relative intensity is still pretty high for sport form is because when you go to competition and lift maximal, your form will probably break down. Like everyone can break down their form a little bit at the max to scrape another couple of kilo. It will happen to everyone. So leaning into that a little bit isn't a bad shout. But SDE, we don't want to practice it in an SDE slot. SDE is about perfect practice and heavy perfect practice. SPE, because it's about muscle gain, needs to be quite a lot of work, which is why sets is still middle ground priority. But it needs to be hard work, which is why number 1 is relative intensity, and 3 is absolute intensity, which is like it doesn't need to be heavy. You can do cable work, which isn't heavy, but like really effective SPE movements, if that makes sense. So on the screen, there's some guidelines for adjusting them. Just take a screenshot of that. So if you come back to a repeat session, you go, you know what, I'm not recovered. You can make the adjustments on the screen there, but it can be per slot. It doesn't need to be across the board. It's like if your bench isn't recovering, you don't need to change SFE, SD, and SPE. Just change one of them and then reassess and see how you get on. However, I also recommend seeing at least, unless you're way off, try see a full block through, because for the most part, sometimes some of the recovery is just from doing new stuff and a new program and stuff like that. It may take 2-3 weeks to fully embed in, and by the 4th week or 5th week, when you do the deload or preload of the next block, you actually feel okay. So moving on. So the next is mesocycle progressions. So back in the day, we'd add sets and sets and sets, and then we'd drop sets and reps and increase it heavier. So accumulation and intensification, and to be honest, it's not the way that it's done at all. It's not the most effective way. This probably should have, it works, don't get me wrong, but that's because this structure, and any structured training is probably going to work. It probably should have died in the 80s or 90s, but it got popular because some genetic freaks followed it and they got popular. So that must be the way to do it, and it's not. So for most people, this way is the way to do it. And the biggest difference in Bondarchuk's style of training is he noticed that lifters have to repeat the exact same stimulus. And the reason why they have to is to stop what's called adaptive resistance. Adaptive resistance is when you keep trying to drive progress by adding more and more weight, there comes a point where your body just says, no, don't like this. It literally just says no, and it refuses to perform, refuses to adapt. You deload, and then you detrain, you come back and you end up back to where you started, probably with a bit of overuse injury. So there's not a way to it. He found that the best way to progress is doing the exact same stimulus. Now, I hear you all going, but what about progressive overload? So here's the thing with progressive overload. People think progressive overload causes change and causes strength. It's not the driver of strength, it's a necessity to occur because you're getting stronger. You now need to lift more or heavier to cause stimulus. So it's more a case of the requirements are growing as you get stronger. However, 3-4 exposures, so in a block, let's say for example your close grip bench slot for SPE on a Wednesday, if you do a full block, you're only going to do 3 or 4 exposures. There's not enough progress in that 3-4 block to warrant adding any weight on the bar. There's probably a bigger fluctuation just from sleep, diet, normal variation, weather, hormones. There's probably a bigger variation in that than the amount of gains that you'll make. So just stick with it. And the reason is when there's more variation and more variability, the predictability goes down. They're inversely correlated. So if at the end of the block you go, oh, well, my squat is great, my deadlift's great, but my bench didn't show any improvement, you don't want to then go, well, was it the loading? Was it the sets? Was it the ramp up of the reps? What was it? If everything's the exact same, then we can say, oh, it's the exercise selection. That's it. That's the only variable, the exercise selection. Providing we're within MEV and MRV, which will establish over time, then it can only be the exercise selection. Not only that, when we come back around to the same cycle, you go, I know what works really well for squat and deadlift. Instead of going, oh, was it the reps? Was it the sets? Was it the accumulation phase? And all this nonsense. It's just the exercise, hard work on the exercise. Now, I'm not saying it can't go heavier every week. If you're training using RPEs instead of percentages and it's RPE and you can accurately gauge your own RPE, then yeah, of course, if you're getting stronger from week to week, that's what RPE is for. Or to cater for bad days, then the weight is going to go up or down, but the effort and on paper is the exact same. So, for example, an SDE slot may be 5 reps at RP9 and then 3 sets of 3 at the same weight. There's nothing to say that that can't be 5-10 kilograms heavier next week, or even 5 kilograms lighter if you had a bad night's sleep. There's nothing to say that. As long as the effort is there, you will elicit the SRA, the adaptation, supercompensation that we seek. So a lot of people forget that, and chasing just adding reps or sets is just set up for failure. It's all about the bigger picture. So anyway, moving on, deloads and preloads. So deloads are just a way to dissipate fatigue, resensitize you to the training effect, and let some micro trauma and other things fully recover. There's more things under the hood that occur as well. So like these chemical changes. So as you train, people think your testosterone increases when you lift weights. Newsflash, it doesn't. It goes down. The harder you train, your hormones plummet, and it's acute, so only short-lived. But the problem is, if you're training frequently and heavily, then your average testosterone will be lower than if you just didn't do anything whatsoever. However, when you fully recover and deload, you spike. You sometimes turn to higher levels than what you would have before. And you're stronger, and you've got more androgen receptors because you've been lifting weights and all the other good stuff. So the net return is positive, but we have to make sure we keep on top of it with deloads and preloads. Now, a deload is at the end of a block, and it's typically 80-90% of what you'd usually lift. So, for example, if you do a top single with a 200 kilo on squat all the way through the block, then you're probably going to be lifting 160 to 180, given that it's 80-90% of your normal loading. Volume or sets is 50-70%. So in this case, you'd probably only do, so if you did 3 or 4 back-offs, you'd probably only do 2 back-offs, for example. And that would sit you in the 50-70%. Now, a preload, the loading parameters are pretty much exactly the same. The difference is with a preload is instead of doing the things that you've just been doing, you do it at the start of a new block, and it gives you a chance to practice the movements that you're going to do. This does two things. One, well, it does more than two things. One, lets the fatigue dissipate, no different to a deload. Arguably even better because it's different movements, and fatigue is so specific to specific movements that even a subtle variation can cause the fatigue to dissipate quicker, which is a bonus. Now, two, gives you practice for the movements that you're going to be doing in the first loading week of the block. So if you're practicing a new movement, when you come to do the movement on the first loading week, you perform better because you're versed in that movement. Whereas if you deloaded and then came to a new block and you had a new foreign movement, you probably wouldn't be outputting the same productivity because your body's reluctant to commit to something that it's unfamiliar with. Don't believe me? Go try throw a stone with your non-dominant hand. It's ridiculous, and it's the exact same concept. Obviously not as drastic as that, but it exists, and we're about optimizing and making sure we're doing everything we can to get the most out of our training. Not only that, even though it's new movements, the loading's still like 80-90% of what you'd usually be expected to be doing, and with half the volume, is still enough probably to elicit a beginner gain. So gains because it's a new movement. If you've just been doing them same movements and then deloaded, that absolutely isn't enough because compared with what you've been doing, it's easier, so you won't you won't gain. However, in a preload, because you're doing new stuff and you've never done them, then actually that's a new stimulus and you probably will gain despite it having like lower physical stress. So what's called the fatigue to stimulus ratio is great because low fatigue, high stimulus because it's a new movement, so you get gains. So you go to the first loading week, you're recovered, you're fresh, you are practiced in the lift you're about to do, and actually you've got some like sneak gains that you could call upon from the first week of the preload. So in summary, preloads are probably more effective than deloads. Deloads do have a purpose, but it's usually at the very, very, very end of a cycle, and it's when you just want to wind down and then probably take some time off or something like that. So the other type of fatigue management, it is fatigue management, but used for a different purpose. It isn't to recover, it's to allow the highest performance on a given day. And it's called a taper. And the reason why we taper is we lift super heavy, but to counter that amount of fatigue, we just start ditching off all the other work that we're doing. So volume takes a massive hit. And it's about retaining as much strength as we can, or even improving strength, while dissipating all our fatigue. And the only way to do that is lifting super heavy with very little work. So typical strategies for the taper are 2 weeks before competition, doing half the amount of work, so half the sets, the volume. And then the week of the competition, early on in the week, people lift heavy. So beginners can go very close to max, whereas advanced lifters, because they've got a bigger SRA curve, will tend to stop close to openers or even last warm-ups for elite lifters. Now, the rest of the week is usually just technical stuff, fully recovering, working on any technical snagging issues with lightweight, and then they go to the competition and they feel very practiced, very fresh, and they only lifted heavy a few days ago, so actually they perform really well. So the taper can be 3 weeks, 4 weeks in some cases, but for most people, a 2-week taper where it's super heavy, half volume, 2 weeks out, super heavy, still super low volume, 1 week out, but the rest of the week is also super light, and that just allows the last of the super compensation that's owed to occur to allow for the big performance at competition. On this topic, competition, is worth mentioning a method called TTP, which is time to peak. And doing this type of training, because we're not accumulating volume, we're not changing the reps, we're not intensifying, it's just dedicated blocks of training, and it's all the same between MEV and MRV. It's just where that work is allocated. It makes everything super predictable, including trends. And most people will see that a certain training day of the whole block will be extremely strong. A perfect example would be session 4 on week 3. Always, without fail, is super strong and we feel like God. So the concept with TTP is you work backwards from a competition. So you make the competition fall on week 3, session 4, and work your training back from that, so that when you go up to competition, the competition falls on week 3, session 4 of the expression cycle, and you perform well. And doing it that way, you don't need to deload, you don't need to taper, you don't need to do anything any different. You just train the exact same as you've usually been, and because of the laws of the time to peak, you perform well. However, in reality, this is a bit of a skill, and it's a lot harder to predict and a lot harder to do, because variations can cause slippage of the TTP. You'll make it like go up or down. So until you've done 1 or 2 full cycles and you can say confidently that your certain session on certain week is very good, don't use this method. I definitely at least train a year before relying on TTP, especially if you're going to a competition. So next episode, I'm going to ask you guys for a volunteer, because I want somebody to use as an example. We'll identify their weaknesses, look at their weekly training, their days that they can train, and we'll flesh them out a full training program, including all SFE, SD, SP, GP slots, each cycle. So the prep cycle, the development cycle, the expression cycle, bridged with intro weeks, and at the very end we will incorporate a taper to allow them to peak. They can hit some good new numbers, and we all get to watch their progress and my design decisions, using everything and nothing on top of what's covered in these episodes. So episodes 1 to 5 will all that be used to make a world-class training program for one of you guys. So yeah, so if it wants to be you, just give us a shout in the comments. The other thing to be wary of is you're going to be going up on video, because we'll analyze your lifts, and I'll also share what tools I use to analyze the lifts. So there's some geeky science software called Tracker, which allows you to see where a bar accelerates and decelerates. So we can go super deep into the individual lifter and create the world-class training program. And I put my money where my mouth is. The proof is in the pudding, and he will hit some big PBs at the very end, no matter his experience and no matter his age, guaranteed. So yeah, thanks for watching, and I look forward to the next episode.